Continuing with our discussion of Japanese internment and resistance and challenges to internment, well, we had just discussed the case of Fred Korematsu, who led a legal challenge to it, but internment was upheld by 63 vote by the Supreme Court. And by the way, there's a picture of Fred Korematsu. Now, alongside this, in other words, a parallel case to the Fred Korematsu case, was the Mitsuye Endo case. And by the way, her first name is spelled Mitsuye, Mitsuye Endo. And here's a picture of her working at the California Department of Motor Vehicles. She works for the DMV. And, as soon as the order was issued for all Japanese Americans to report to the relocation centers, she challenged it. She applied for habeas corpus once sent to that relocation camp in Santa Anita. And she had to wait years for this. But when the court finally got a hold of her case, it turns out that her case was victorious. She won her case and therefore won her freedom. Okay, so it's interesting to note that, as I mentioned, these are parallel cases. And to make it even more interesting, the Supreme Court decided the very same day on both cases. But as it would turn out, there were very different legal focuses. That explains why the Korematsu case upheld internment, while the Endo case basically rendered the decision that the constitutional rights of the Japanese Americans were indeed violated, and therefore they should be set free. Okay, so how could this happen? Well, with the Korematsu case, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of removing Japanese Americans from the West Coast due to military necessity. And I mentioned that earlier, right? Let's recall that justification, military necessity, was rendered by General John DeWitt, later repeated by Hugo Black with the Korematsu case. Now, this parallel case with Endo, here the Supreme Court ruled that the government could not detain a loyal U.S. citizen without due process. Okay, so it's a different legal angle there. But the Supreme Court, therefore, ruled that internment was indeed unconstitutional. And like I said, it led to the release of prisoners. Okay, so while Korematsu said removal was legal, Endo said continued detention was not. And that decision forced the government to begin shutting down the camps and freeing Japanese prisoners by early 1945. And just to add to this drama, the Roosevelt administration, FDR, who of course was president at the time, actually announced plans to close the internment camps one day before the Endo ruling. Why? Because they knew that they were going to lose the court case. So, with the Endo decision by the end of 1944, the WRA, the War Relocation Authority, finally began to initiate release of the Japanese prisoners. First, they released the Nisei, the second generation, and then the Issei and all others. And it was a drawn-out process. There was this bureaucracy involved. But interestingly enough, there was no actual investigation with each applicant. All the FBI did was check the names of the applicants who were applying for release, and they checked to see if they were part of a list of suspects that were deemed disloyal to the U.S., and if they weren't on that list, well, they were freed. So the main point here is this. It was only after mass evacuation and internment, that's to say evacuation from the West Coast, and then internment inland, as we discussed. Only after those processes were able to assuage the public fears was the government willing to consider the loyalty of Japanese Americans. They were presumed guilty before proven innocent. In fact, they never got the legal chance to prove their innocence. If you recall, the Italians and Germans who were in the United States with the outbreak of war, well, some of them were charged with potential disloyalty, but each one were tried on an individual basis. This is in stark contrast to the Japanese, who were lumped all together into one racial category. So again, they were presumed guilty before proven innocent. Now, an interesting occurrence actually happened right with the closure of the camps, and that's that some, not a lot, but some protested the close of the camps. So how could this be? Why would some Japanese Americans actually protest their release? Well, it's this. It's because with their imprisonment, they lost everything. And they felt so impaired by internment that, they don't have any homes, no assets. They felt that they could not survive outside the camps. And indeed, the Japanese American Community League, if you recall that, the JACL, and other groups too, actually requested financial assistance from the government. But the WRA, the War Relocation Authority, actually rejected their pleas for financial assistance. The only money that was provided for the freed prisoners, the Japanese Americans, was transportation fare, the transfer allowance out of the camp. To be exact, $50 was allotted per family, and then $25 was allotted per individual. So that's it. Okay. And after that, the Japanese are expected to fend for themselves, especially economically, when they got everything taken away from them, for the most part. Now, let's not forget the young Nisei men who volunteered to fight in the European theaters during World War II. Let's recall that the overwhelming majority of the Nisei young men indeed volunteered, and they did form a Nisei regiment. And the Nisei regiment is the 442nd Regiment here. And as indicated in the title here of the slide, it turned out that due to their heroics and valor displayed on the battlefield, by the end of the war, they would be the most decorated Army regiment in U.S. history. Okay, and indeed, it's one of the most important and heroic units in U.S. military history, not just because of its heroics and incredible combat record, which I'll get to in a second, but because of who its soldiers were when they served. They were the Japanese Americans who were not trusted. They faced racism and suspicion at home, but they still chose to fight for the United States. So again, as stated, it's the most decorated unit in U.S. military history, for its size at least, for the size and length of service. Statistically, they won over 18,000 awards for bravery. And the honors include 21 medals of honor. Okay, now, interestingly enough, at the conclusion of World War II, only one Medal of Honor was conferred, and that's due to pretty much racism. Okay, didn't want to distribute too many Medals of Honor to Japanese Americans. But it's only after decades later, with post-war investigations and research, did they decide to extend Medals of Honors to the 442nd Regiment, those who deserved it. And it turned out to be 21 recipients of the Medal of Honor. Not to mention 9,486 Purple Hearts, 8 Presidential Unit citations. The 442nd Regiment also received around 560 Silver Stars and around 4,000 Bronze Stars. So, as you can see, this is impressive and makes you wonder, why did they receive so many medals? Well, you have to come to the conclusion that they had this burning desire to prove that they were loyal and that they were American. So they had something to prove on the battlefield. And it definitely shows in the extent to which they received all these awards, thus becoming the most decorated regiment in U.S. military, just to repeat. Now, with the end of World War II, by 1948, the Truman administration recognized the bravery of the 442nd Regiment and actually issued something called the Japanese American Claims Act of 1948. And in the Senate words, here is a quote from a senator: "The question of whether the evacuation of the Japanese people from the West Coast was justified is now moot. The government did move these people bodily, and the resulting loss was great. And the principles of justice and responsible government require that there should be compensation for such losses." So there you go. It's a recognition that this was indeed an egregious mistake perpetrated by the U.S. government. And then decades later, by the 1970s, then President Gerald Ford, during the 34th anniversary of Japanese internment, basically repealed Executive Order 9066, acknowledged it as a quote-unquote national mistake. And then the next president, President Jimmy Carter, in 1980, set up a commission to look into the WRA, the War Relocation, and to determine if any harm was done to the Japanese people. And if so, what remedial action should be taken. All right. And basically this leads to, by the Reagan administration in the 1980s, leads to the issuance by the government of a national apology to the Japanese Americans, along with compensation. And the political pressure, by the way, was done by something called the Redress Movement, and is comprised of Japanese Americans at that time, younger, maybe even third generation Japanese Americans who may have been very young in the concentration camps, right, if not even born, accompanied by American attorneys. And their effort was to not only recognize this as a mistake, but also to put forth the notion of compensation for the survivors. And indeed, that became the case by the 1980s.